I recently discovered a group called Jesus Christians, and there was one person that was involved in Jesus Christians who wrote a lot of videos, and I, listen, while I clean the church, while I'm off the floors and did other things. I had my headphones in, and I listened to quite a few sermons, and there's a red flag that came up when I was listening to these sermons. Now, I'm not naming names. I'm doing this to help you, not to point a finger at somebody else. But I think the speaker fell into a common misconception. He referred to the Gospels as the teachings of Jesus, and he referred to the Epistles as the teachings of the apostles, or the teachings of the disciples. So, just by doing that, just by saying, well, Acts and the Epistles are the teachings of the disciples, but the four Gospels, these are the teachings of Jesus. Well, first of all, how do you think we got the four Gospels? We got the four Gospels from the oral tradition of the disciples. Anyway, is it right? Is it fair to say the four Gospels are the teachings of Jesus, and then we really downplay the whole rest of the New Testament, and we say, those New Testament, it's not the teachings of Jesus, it's the teaching of the disciples. Acts and the Epistles and Hebrews, that's not the teaching of Jesus, that's the teachings of the disciples. Is it right to do that? No, it's not. The whole New Testament is the teachings of Jesus. We don't have a full view of the teachings of Jesus if we just rely on Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. John himself says in John 21:25, he says, "And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself will not contain the books that would be written." Now, John's the most theological of the Gospels, and he himself, who includes things that the other Gospels don't include, like Jesus with the adulterous woman, like Jesus turning water into wine, like Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. John has teaching and events that weren't in the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, or Luke, and he says that not everything's written, that if actually everything Jesus did and said, if it was all written, we would just have a little fraction of it. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but we have a fraction. No, if everything was actually written, if everything that Jesus did was written, the world couldn't contain all that teaching. That's what John is saying. So we can use logic to say, well, if we just use Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, we just have a fraction of what Jesus actually taught and what Jesus actually did. So if the Gospels are just a fraction of what Jesus did, and the Bible itself admits this, John admits this, if the Bible is just a fraction of what Jesus did, well then how can we come with a more complete view of what Jesus did? Friends, that's where the epistles come in. Because guess who was with Jesus with all those things that aren't reported? Peter was. John was. The disciples were with Jesus during everything that wasn't reported. John says, and there were also many things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself will not contain the books. They're not written. But guess who were there? The disciples. So then when the disciples speak about Jesus, when they speak about Jesus in an epistle, they have a complete knowledge of the teachings of Jesus. The epistles aren't the teachings of the disciples. They are the complete view of the teachings of Jesus. Now, yes, they are being interpreted. Now, let's use Paul for an example. Paul was raised Jewish, and he was a persecutor to Christians. Then he encountered the risen Jesus Christ. And then he spent time with Christians, and then, before he even started his missionary work, he went and he met with Peter and James, and they validated, they had a conversation, and he learned the truth from them. He learned himself the teachings of Jesus. So then when he writes a book for 1 Corinthians, well, 1 Corinthians is meant for the church in Corinth, but he's interpreting their problems in light of the teaching of Jesus. You see? He's applying the teachings of Jesus that he received from Peter and James. He's interpreting that in a pastoral letter. That's how we gain the complete teachings of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that we just take the epistles and not the Gospels, but I'm not saying we take the Gospels and not the epistles either. We need all the books because together they form the teachings of Jesus. Now, some people will say, yeah, but the teachings of Jesus, Peter, like in 1st and 2nd Peter, that's the teachings of Peter. That's not the teachings of Jesus. Friends, that's the teaching of Jesus. And if you're going to use that argument, think it through. The book of Mark was a book, tradition says that John Mark was heavily reliant on the Apostle Peter. So if you're going to say that Peter's epistle, he just gave his opinion, then how can you not say that he just gave his opinion to John Mark? Do you see how that kind of goes two ways? I think it's better to say that the Apostle Peter shared the teachings of Jesus with John Mark, but then he also shared the teachings of Jesus in his epistle. And there's some people that date his epistle first. Maybe not the epistle of Peter, but Paul's letters were written before the Gospel of John was written. The whole New Testament is based on the teachings of Jesus. Because a lot of these epistles were written by disciples of Jesus who listened to his teachings that we may not have even heard, that may not have even be in the scriptures. And there's a lot of scholars that say that we don't even have the full sermons of Jesus, that we just have summaries. So there's a lot of things that we're missing out. But guess who didn't miss out? Well, the disciples didn't miss out. So that's why it's very important for us to read everything that they wrote. Everything. That's why it's very important for us to hear what Paul said. Someone who spent a significant amount of time with Peter. Someone who spent a significant amount of time with Barnabas, who also spent time with Peter. You see, friends, it's connected. It's all connected. And if you think that, well, the book of James is just James' opinion, not the teaching of Jesus, or the book of John, the epistle of John, even though he says, well, this is what we receive from him, he's talking about receiving it from Jesus, but you think that's it, but you're just going to say that's John's opinion. That doesn't make sense. The Bible doesn't even say that. Now, there are a couple places in the Bible where Paul says, well, this is what I say and not the Lord. But see, the Bible identifies those moments, which even brings it clearer that when the Bible doesn't say that, then we can take it to the bank that this is what God says. Friends, we know what Jesus said from the eyewitnesses, from the disciples. It's very important for us to view. It's very important for us to get our theology from the whole scriptures. The whole scriptures are the teaching of Jesus. And yeah, that's my response. Let's not, before we shortchange the epistles, let's be mindful that God ordained them, the Holy Spirit ordained them to be canon. And also, they were written by the same people that also were the people that were behind the accounts that the Gospels were behind. So you can't change that. It's all connected. You can't say, well, I'm just going to go by the Gospels, because the very people who are responsible for the information we have in the Gospels are the very people who are responsible for the epistles. And you might say, well, Paul wasn't there for Jesus' 3 years of ministry. Well, that's true. But Paul also spent significant time with Peter and James, as I already said, and he confirmed with them their story.